This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, Archetypal Antagonists, for each of the 6 archetypal character arcs. Antagonists are an interesting consideration for any writer. So often when we conceive or plot a story, the antagonist may be an afterthought, especially in genre or plot-driven fiction, in which the antagonist is less likely to be in a relationship with the protagonist and more likely to be a big bad of some sort. But in many ways, the antagonist in any type of story is the point. The antagonist is the reason there is a story at all. Without the antagonist, without something to oppose the protagonist's forward progress or to prompt the protagonist's growth through the necessity for evolving personal and social paradigms, we don't have much of a story, do we? At the least, we don't have much of a transformation. And so, it is just as worthwhile to examine archetypal antagonists as it is archetypal protagonists. Earlier this year, I shared a lengthy series about archetypal character arcs. This series discussed certain archetypes of positive change, negative regression or stagnation, and resting or flat arcs that intersperse the major transformational cycles of the human life. Many of these archetypes interact with each other as one another's antagonists. Particularly the negative shadow archetypes can often be seen as both the inner and outer antagonists that positive archetypes, such as the hero or the queen, may have to overcome in order to complete their own character arcs. Within the series, I also recognized and mentioned, but did not discuss in depth, certain archetypal antagonists that are more abstract and not always characterized as specific human antagonists in the same way as the negative archetypes. Early on in that series publication, one of you asked that I explore these archetypal antagonistic forces in greater depth, a request for which I am very grateful as it has prompted me to further exploration and thought on this evergreen topic of archetypal characters and arcs. So today, I'm going to kick off a comparatively short series looking at the archetypal antagonists inherent within each of the 6 main archetypal life arcs. Following is an overview reminder of each of these arcs, as well as the adjoining archetypal antagonists we will be discussing in this new series. We start with the Maiden arc, whose archetypal antagonists are authority and predator. Then we have the Hero arc, whose archetypal antagonists are the dragon and the sick king. We have the Queen arc, whose archetypal antagonists are the invader and the empty throne. The King arc, whose archetypal antagonists are the cataclysm and the rebels. The Crone arc, whose archetypal antagonists are the death blight and the tempter. And the Mage arc, whose archetypal antagonists are evil and the weakness of humankind. In future posts, we will examine each of these more closely in relationship to the specific arcs. For today, I want to start with a quick overview of what these archetypal antagonists represent globally throughout the arcs. One of the reasons I didn't thoroughly expand upon the archetypal antagonists in the original series was because the overarching thematic antagonists within each arc or journey are clearly abstract forces: dragon, cataclysm, death, evil, etc. Although they can be personified or anthropomorphized in certain types of stories, for example, Smaug in The Hobbit, or death in Harry Potter's The Tale of the Three Brothers, in any realistic story, these forces will be symbolically represented by either a mere human or a human system, or simply an abstraction that is never even named beyond the protagonist's inner struggle. For example, the evil faced by Will Smith's mage character in The Legend of Bagger Vance is merely one man's loss of meaning and purpose after suffering in World War I. And this is where it becomes important to distinguish between an antagonist and an antagonistic force. Defined simply, the antagonist in a story is whoever or whatever consistently creates obstacles between the protagonist and his or her ultimate plot goal. Although the archetypal antagonists we will be discussing in this series are recognized as representing a moral corruption of some sort, the word antagonist in itself never indicates any kind of moral alignment. It is possible for the antagonist to be the most moral person in the story, and the protagonist the least moral, which is often the case in stories with a negative change arc protagonist. Therefore, the antagonist need not be human, or even specifically conscious. Generally, the term antagonist can be used to distinguish a human or humanized antagonist, while the broader term antagonistic force can be used to indicate a more abstract form of obstacle to the protagonist's forward progression. More than that, it is both possible and prevalent to see a specific human antagonist representing a greater and more abstract antagonistic force. For example, in The Lord of the Rings, the sorcerer Saruman is a proxy, both directly at times, for the greater antagonistic force of Sauron, who is a barely anthropomorphized representation of evil, and we also see Saruman as a human antagonist against whom the protagonists must do battle. Antagonistic forces, even more than antagonists, have a tendency to be deeply thematic. They may even be nothing more within the story than a representation of the lie the protagonist believes, and which the protagonist must overcome in order to continue down a growthful path. Even if the protagonist must physically defeat a human antagonist in the end, that final outward battle is really only a representation, that is, an externalized metaphor of the defeat of the greater thematic antagonist. Therefore, it is often useful and even desirable to create a story that offers both an antagonistic force and a specific antagonist to represent that abstract force within the actual plot conflict. As I began thinking about expanding the archetypal antagonists, I realized all of the 6 main positive change life arcs offered up inherently archetypal examples of both the thematic antagonistic force, for example, the king's cataclysm, and a more practical plot-based antagonist represented by another character or characters, as the king's rebels. Whether or not you choose to characterize these separately, they offer the opportunity to more thoroughly examine your protagonist's inner and outer conflicts, and how you can bring them together with cohesion and resonance. As you may have noticed in my previously mentioned list of archetypal antagonists, I've added a few that weren't directly specified as such in the original series. This is because I've put equal emphasis on both types of antagonist for each archetypal arc. However, which antagonist is represented in the outer conflict and which is primarily a concern of the inner conflict will depend on how you choose to dramatize your story's theme. For example, in a maiden arc, her inner conflict may concentrate on her own internalized sense of authority, while the predator is externalized, as in Jane Eyre. Equally valid, however, would be the presentation of a disempowering and devouring predator as her own inner critic, while she faces abusive or restrictive authority in the external plot, as in Little Dorrit. Really, they are two sides of the same coin, one representing the other, but ultimately both representing the same thematic struggle. The emphasis of one over the other often depends on whether the story itself is more internal and relationship driven or more external and action driven. Regardless, your protagonist will confront both in some guise in the end. If the external antagonist is to be defeated, it is usually because the protagonist has already conquered the internal antagonist. Or if the inner conflict isn't much addressed within the story, then the destruction of the external antagonist can be seen as a metaphor for the character's internal triumph over the greater antagonistic force. Another pairing to consider is that of antagonist and contagonist. Within the Dramatica system of story theory, Chris Huntley and Melanie Ann Phillips coined the term contagonist to indicate an opposing force within the story who was not as directly opposed to the protagonist as the actual antagonist. Although sometimes the contagonist might be a direct proxy for the antagonist, or what John Truby calls a false ally, the contagonist is just as likely to be a character who, at least on the plot level, if not a thematic one, is totally separate from the main antagonistic force. The contagonist is a sort of subplot antagonist, one who may be closer to the protagonist than the actual big bad antagonist, and who therefore has more influence over the protagonist's internal conflict. The Dramatica system contrasts the contagonist with the mentor when in a supporting character role, and together they act as the competing devil and angel on the protagonist's shoulders, each seeking to be the impact character who influences the protagonist's thematic choices and determines whether the protagonist will remain in the lie or evolve into the truth. Although the archetypal antagonist pairings we will be discussing will not always neatly fall into antagonist-contagonist roles, it is useful to keep this dynamic in mind as another way to examine the greater and more abstract thematic antagonistic force and the nearer and more intimate human antagonists that people your story. Again, Saruman in Lord of the Rings presents a good example in that he offers a specific human antagonist who can be seen to fill that role across archetypes, depending on which characters are opposing him: heroes, queens, crones, mages, etc. For example, he can be seen variously as the sick king whose realm is dying because of his neglect and whom the hero, Frodo, must heal, but also as the tyrant whom Aragorn, representing the queen archetype, must replace, and also as the tempter whom Gandalf the Grey, as the crone archetype, must resist. Saruman is the proxy of the overarching antagonistic force represented by Sauron, but he is also operating on his own account, sometimes even secretly in opposition to Sauron. His presence within the story allows the characters to confront different facets and embodiments of the overarching thematic antagonistic force, which would not have been available if they had merely faced the big bad Sauron. In many ways, understanding your story's antagonist and/or antagonistic force is the key, not just to the plot, but to understanding your story's true thematic significance, whether it is specifically following an archetypal plot or not. So stay tuned. Next week, we will examine the Maiden's archetypal antagonists of authority and the predator. And in the meantime, I hope you'll stop by the blog and tell me your opinions. Can you identify any archetypal antagonists or antagonistic forces that you have portrayed in your own stories? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.